Today's episode is brought to you by Qualtrics. ELGL and Civic Pulse, with the support of Qualtrics, have launched the latest diversity dashboard where you can view gender data for chief appointed officers for all local governments in the U.S. with a population of 1,000 people or more. The diversity dashboard empowers you to know who's in the room. But there are lots of other things that we need to consider when we're talking about equity and diversity. You got to know about people's experiences, what barriers do women and other non-dominant groups in local government face in the workplace. And these are questions that Qualtrics empowers organizations to ask with its experience management platform. With Qualtrics, local governments are able to design and improve public services to be more inclusive and representative of the people they are serving. You can learn more about Qualtrics by going to qualtrics.com/government. That's QUALTRICS.com/government. Hey y'all, coming to you from Jacksonville, Florida. This is GovLove, a podcast about local government, brought to you by engaging local government leaders. I'm Ben Kittelson, Senior Consultant at Raftellus and GovLove co-host. We have a great episode for you today. We're going to be talking equity and libraries in Hennepin County. But first, the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. Engaging Local Government Leaders is a professional association engaging the brightest minds in local government. And mark your calendars. Our annual conference is coming up this fall, October 13th and 14th, in Phoenix, Arizona. You can learn more about the conference by going to elgl.org/ELGL22. Now, let me introduce today's guests. First, Christy Mulligan is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Coordinator for Hennepin County Library, a position she has been in since 2017. And she spent over 17 years with the library, including librarian roles that involved facilitating community connections and providing youth services. And our second guest, Ayanna Muata, is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Project Manager for Hennepin County Library, a position she has been in since 2019. She also served as the Patron Experience Supervisor for the library and worked at the Hamline University Law School Library. So with that, Christy, Ayanna, welcome to GovLove. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining us.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you for having us.
So we have a tradition on the podcast to start with a lightning round. So these are some fun questions to get us started. And since you are people that work for libraries, we'll start with a very relevant one. Christy, why don't you go first? What book are you currently reading?
Well, I always have too many books on my nightstand, so I actually have two or three that I'm reading right now. I am doing a slow, long rereading of My Grandmother's Hands by Resmaa Menakem, and then I also just started reading The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. Very cool. And Ayanna, what about you?
I just finished reading An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, the youth version, and now I'm reading James Spooner's graphic novel. It's called The High Desert, Black Punk Everywhere. It's a memoir.
Awesome. Okay, a bunch of books, we should add to, listeners will have to add to their list. All right, so next lightning round question, and Ayanna, will make you go first on this one. What was the first movie that you saw in theaters?
Well, let's see. I was born in the late 60s, so I don't actually remember, but because my parents loved taking us to the movies. Probably had something to do with Disney or Looney Tunes. So, yeah, I'm sure it was something along those lines, maybe a Mickey Mouse or something like that.
Yeah, that's fair. And Christy, what about you?
I actually did remember this one. It was The Outsiders. And I remember I was like older elementary school, which is funny because I would have thought it would have been when I was younger, but we didn't really go out to the movies a lot when I was little. So
nice. The Outsiders. That's much classier. I mean, mine was, I think with Ayanna, it was The Lion King. It was definitely a Disney offering back in the day. So all right. And then my next lightning round question, and Christy, we can make you go first on this one. Where do you go for inspiration?
I love that question. Sometimes I have to go into nature. I think sometimes I need solitude. So I'll go to this nature preserve by my house and just walk, often with my dog. But also really people are where I get a lot of my inspiration. So, talented coworkers, talented people all over the world, which could be like music, a podcast or, a book or an article. It's kind of a balance of both, I guess.
Nice. And Ayanna, what about you?
Yeah, I'm just nodding. I know the viewers can't see that, but all of that. I go I look for inspiration anywhere I can find it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So sometimes that might be walks to the river, music. I'm also a musician, and so I love to listen to and play music, meditation, and then oddly enough, podcasts. I love podcasts. I always learn something, and that does inspire me.
Very nice. Those are good answers. All right, and I'm always curious whenever I host a podcast about folks' path to local government, because I think one of the cool things about the field is that there is no one way to get to to a certain job or a certain level within local government. So, Ayanna, why don't you go first? What was your path to local government? How did you end up kind of working for the Hennepin County Library?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess in short, it's like a combination of education and libraries. So I spent many years in K-12 as support for their library and media center. I also worked in different positions for a couple of youth-related nonprofits, and then I moved to a position in a law school. That was at William Mitchell College of Law, and then it became Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, and I was there for a little less than a decade. And while I was there, I kind of considered taking the LSAT myself and maybe even enrolling at some point. But then I realized my capacity to seriously consider law school in terms of family obligations and financial commitment, 2 kids that needed to get into college, just wasn't conducive to me taking that path. So it was from that point that I connected with Hennepin County and saw that there were positions in their library system. And I joined Hennepin County Library in 2016 and have been there since.
Awesome. Were like public libraries on your radar at all? Or was it just, hey, I'm looking for something new and this seems close enough that I want to try it?
I had spent so much of my career in academic settings and working with youth that I was looking into ways that I could do things a little bit differently in terms of giving back to community. And there's a public library in my neighborhood specifically that I always kind of had this dream, like I would love to run that library. Very much a community oriented person. I'm very connected to my neighbors and what's going on around me in the town that I live in. And so, it was a natural transition to that. Yeah. So that's a great question. Thank you.
Very cool. And Christy, what about you? How did you end up at the Hennepin County Library?
Well, I spent most of my time in libraries as a child and got my first library card from the Hennepin County Library. But even as I left Minnesota and spent time in other places, libraries were just always this space that I would kind of gravitate towards. And after college, I started working for a publishing industry, and just wasn't really feeling like a good fit for me for the long term. And I just kind of had this light bulb moment one day, just realizing that libraries were the spaces I always wanted to be in. So why not work there? And I just really wanted to make a shift to public service. And so that's how I ended up at Hennepin.
Awesome. And I'm curious for both of you, is there something that kept you at your library? I mean, both you guys are both, or maybe Christy, you've been there longer than Ayanna has, but is there something that kept you being like, hey, public libraries, this is the place to be and I want to stay here?
Well, I think Ayanna kind of touched on this, just having a neighborhood in her community, but that was the same for me too. Just living in the city of Minneapolis and spending so much time in just wanting to be part of the service in my own community. And so I think, I haven't moved. If I move from Hennepin County, then maybe I'll work somewhere else. But for now, it's really kind of a dedication to library service in the place I live.
Yeah, I don't know that I can say it better than that.
Yeah. That's fair. That is a good answer. Cool. Well, before we kind of get into some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you guys are doing at the library, can you give our listeners maybe a sense of the library system? Like you mentioned, it's part of the Minneapolis area, but like how large is the system? How many locations? How many residents do you serve? That kind of thing.
We have 41 libraries, plus we have our outreach services, which provides library service by mail to residents who can't access materials in our physical spaces. And then we also provide library service to our correctional facilities over a pretty big geographic area. So, as you said, it's the city of Minneapolis, and there's a number of libraries in the city, and then we've got inner ring and outer ring suburbs all the way out to small towns like St. Bonifacius, Minnesota, that really borders on rural, and that's serving 1.2 million residents. And I looked it up today; it's over 611 square miles. So it's a really big, broad and diverse area with just, and then we also do our phone and online service too.
Wow. Yeah. And I imagine that's a challenge doing the both rural small towns to, a core of a pretty major urban center.
Yeah. And in fact, interestingly enough, it used to be two library systems that merged maybe about a decade ago or more. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but, so that was big, just we used to have a suburban and then a city systems, and those merged a while ago.
Interesting. Cool. Well, and as maybe a way into our conversation, can you give a sense of like how did the diversity, equity, and inclusion work come about in the library? Obviously it's become more of a focus for some cities and counties across the country, but I'm curious how the library came to be like, hey, this is something we need to start within this system.
Yeah, I can jump in and answer that question. I think it feels really important to acknowledge that there's just a lot of people who have led, advocated for, supported diversity, equity, and inclusion work for a long time. So I would say since before I was part of the library system or in a formal role supporting this, it's really evolved over time. There have been diversity committees and councils, but it has been, maybe within the last 10 years that there have been people who have had it formally in their position. And Ayanna and I kind of started working on some of the work we've done over the last several years in 2015 or 2016. We worked with some external consultants to conduct a needs assessment that, included a lot of engagement with our staff, kind of understanding how are we doing in terms of inclusion in our workplace, and then developing a strategic plan out of that. We also joined the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, also known as GARE, in 2016, as did Hennepin County. So that really kicked off a lot of the work that we've focused on over the past few years. And I should say that Hennepin County has been on quite a journey where, we've had our county board and our leaders declare racism as a public health crisis. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are core values for all of our staff. And the county as a whole has made a commitment to really recognize and reduce the racial disparities that exist in our community, which are some of the greatest in the country. So I think that's, while the library has had its own unique journey in that, we've really been fortunate to have really strong leadership from the county too that's supporting that work.
Yeah, I think the county supporting that work is really critical to us being able to move forward in the library.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm curious, were these like new roles, the equity, diversity and inclusion coordinator and project manager, or were they kind of like, hey, you guys are interested in this, let's, rather than doing it kind of with part of your job, like, let's just make it your whole job. How did that work?
That's a great question. We did have, we had a diversity and inclusion manager some years ago. And after that individual moved on, there was an effort to hire for the position. But one of our previous directors actually I ended up moving into the position as sort of a 12 to 18 month temporary position with the goal of kind of hiring and posting. And I'm still in that role today, which has just been, I feel so privileged and lucky to have been able to support this work. And then just also super great. While Ayanna and I have worked together through teams on our DEI work over the last several years, we were able to get support for a second position in our department in 2019. And so I often say we're like a mighty team of two. Yeah. There's two of us, but it is really awesome that there are two of us, because there are certainly other library systems where people may be doing this as part of their job, or they might just have one person in that role. So I feel like we're really lucky to have the two of us for sure.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you mentioned you guys did a needs assessment around kind of what diversity, equity, and inclusion might look like within the library system. Is there any like of those findings that you remember or are now still part of your work that are guiding, or that were core or big takeaways? Or I guess maybe some of the findings from that.
Yeah, I can definitely say that we have learned a lot over the last few years in doing this work and putting our attention to it, and having a department that has the sole focus of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and advancing racial equity in our organization. And we're always learning about the different areas where we may need to recommend things like specific trainings, or work with human resources on areas such as recruitment or retention, findings that have to do with patrons' experiences and staff experiences, and different ways that we might be able to help to support more equity in our processes and our services. One of the examples might be just a training that we're engaging in around how to respond to harassment in the moment and setting healthy boundaries. So just trying to kind of do what we can to take some of the feedback that we've received from surveys that we've put out, and just lots of different conversations we've had, and take that feedback and use it to do things better. So my role is project manager and also consultant. So that means I get to work one-on-one with staff at times, or in teams with staff. So it's a kind of a dual functionality there. So we learn a lot from having those conversations.
Very cool. Well, and one of the things I've noticed kind of talking with different DEI groups in different local governments across the country is you can either focus, or maybe not either, but there tends to either be a focus like internally on staff and on how do we make maybe our workplace more equitable, versus an external focus on like how do we, make the patient experience more equitable, or make sure we're serving the whole community more equitably. How would you guys maybe, I don't know, Ayanna, if you want to start us here, but is there like, how would you guys, I guess, characterize like the balance there? Are you guys trying to do both? Is there maybe a primary focus on one or the other?
Yeah, I definitely think it needs to be a both and I think it's important to name that, because our community members are also folks who often are part of our staff, so caring for our community and doing right by our community and operating with integrity also means treating staff in a way that is, forward thinking in that way. I think I'm probably going to be jumbling over my words here, but yeah, I think doing one or the other would not be doing our due diligence. I feel like we have to be thinking about both our roles as an institution that serves the public, and also our role as an institution that has care and concern for our staff.
Yeah.
And Christy, you can probably say that better than me without probably stuttering and fumbling over words.
That was beautiful. I was going to just say that, like, hard to add anything to that. I will say one thing that comes to mind too is just that with a 2-person department, one of the things that we think about a lot or talk about a lot is that our kind of number one goal is that we're all building skills to advance equity in our day-to-day work. And so that includes staff that, develop programs for the public or deliver day-to-day public service, or, our high-level leadership. Everybody needs to be really embedding this in their work. And so, we think about both but we think about, like, how do we support our colleagues and our organization so that folks have opportunities to learn and grow and build skills and get support where they need it. So, we like to provide coaching and consultation, or, be part of a conversation when there's a project coming up, so that it's not a separate thing, but it's woven into hopefully everything that we're doing.
No, that makes total sense. So some of those, like, projects you might be helping, other library staff with, are there maybe a couple of examples of, like, hey, this was the project, this was maybe how we helped out, or, the role that we played in adding equity as a lens or as a component to what otherwise may have been a less equitable project?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about what we just went through with the pandemic, the start of the pandemic in 2020, and how we had to immediately shift our focus from what we were doing as far as in-person programs and services to shifting to these kind of rapid response teams to mitigate, the crisis that we were in, the harm from the crisis that we were in with COVID. And so projects had to be shifted and adjusted, and we had to do a lot of creative strategies around just how we would even engage with stakeholders under the conditions that we were in with COVID and with all the protocols. So we had to be really careful how we did that. And I'm losing the exact question that you just asked, but
well, yeah, just some examples of that. So, like, yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, you're changing how you're delivering services and doing programs, and now how do you add an equity lens to that, right?
Right. And so just to really be in close communication with each other, with our partners, with folks in the community, to understand better how they were moving through that experience, so that we could understand better how to adjust our response. Because the thing to really remark about projects, especially during that time, is that, this was unprecedented. Like, we had never done anything like that before. So to me, we really learned a lot about project management, but also project management in a crisis like that, and something that we could not draw from our previous experience. And I don't know if Christy wants to say more about that.
I think that's a great example, just all the work to shift and be responsive during the pandemic. And I guess, like, a concrete example that I might add is that for a big period of time at the beginning of the pandemic, our libraries were closed. And, our libraries are spaces where a lot of residents come to access the internet. And libraries are critical spaces to get that access. So Ayanna was a project manager at that time and consultant with some work to identify how we continue to make sure that we're supporting our residents who need critical internet access when our libraries were closed. So distribution of hotspots, distribution of Chromebooks, boosting Wi-Fi in our library locations so that someone could access it, from the parking lot, for example. Those were all things that you explicitly used a racial equity lens to figure out what our solutions looked like, who our partners were, and how we approached it.
Oh, Very cool. So, Ayanna, I'm curious, like, how did you use a racial equity lens then to help with that? Because that's a really fascinating thing that, maybe a traditionally you wouldn't think of as like the library's role necessarily, but it's obviously a huge equity component. Like if you're a public place where folks can get Wi-Fi and now all of a sudden you're not open, like that's a pretty big deal for folks like on the other side of the digital divide. So what did that look like to like say, hey, we need to make sure we're still serving this community?
Yeah, I mean, I think just really understanding that the bottom line is that, understanding equity and diversity, equity, and inclusion is really critical to all the work that we're doing in libraries. So, as libraries are so deeply embedded in our communities, and there are people who depend on us for things that support their basic needs, so like Christy said, internet service, information resources, academic support, sometimes a cool place to shelter from the heat, or maybe even a warm space, right, to shelter from the cold. And even for others, maybe a gathering place to be in community with others to kind of help reduce those feelings of isolation. And you don't have to pay, anything to come and visit us or take advantage of anything that I just shared, So our goal was to provide services and resources and spaces that support people who need it the most. And so it's always important to remember that, disparities that are experienced impact our BIPOC community members and others with marginalized communities in very distinctive ways. And so, it's just really important that we recognize that and that we are moving to build systems that can support reducing and mitigating that harm. So it's just always having that awareness, coming to everything that we do. And that's when I'm speaking about, how we feel like we're just so deeply embedded in our communities in just the work that we do in libraries in a general sense. So just really just approaching all of our work with that lens so that we're always asking that question, right? Who benefits from this, whether it's a policy, a process, a service, an interaction, are there those who might be harmed? And what does that harm look like? And who are those people? And how can we responsibly move to, again, reduce that harm or mitigate the impact of that. So I think that's an example of just what we do, just really staying aware of bringing that lens to all of what we're doing in library and using, we have actually a tool, a racial equity impact tool too, that is a more formalized way. And we have other tools as well that we can kind of layer over things like processes, maybe a program idea, proposal, and so that we can kind of, just have a better understanding and see it in writing even, just how things shake out to just kind of hold ourselves accountable as an institution to make sure that we're not just talking about advancing equity, but we actually have tools to make sure that we can see and measure that we are making progress.
Yeah. Yeah, because talking is a good first step. You want those next steps too are important.
Yeah.
Is there an example of maybe a time where y'all applied that tool and changed how a program was administered, a process, a policy that after like looking at it from using this tool, you decide we need to change how we're doing something?
Yeah. I was just going to use the example. I'm on a lot of different hiring teams, and I was just going to use the example of just using the tool to really revisit, when there is a posting or a job that needs to be filled, really kind of taking a step back to assess whether or not the job that is currently being described is actually the job that we need to hire for. And we have been able to use the tool to kind of rethink requirements, to kind of rethink even our approach to recruitment and to the interview process itself. I won't get into super specific examples, but I'll just say that, yes, it feels really wonderful to be able to use that tool to look at how we're doing things, even in our hiring, and to do that better.
That's a great example, Ayanna. We are just really kind of starting to use this tool in a more, in a deeper way. And so we have a few projects that are just kind of in early stages, but one from a while back that comes to mind is connected to the conversation we were having around internet access during the beginning of the pandemic, is that we had a limited amount of funding to boost the internet signal in some of our locations so that people could access it from outside of our building. And we used data. We used the racial equity impact tool and looking at data and community engagement, which are two really important steps, to figure out which locations we would choose. If we could only choose 4 or 5, we looked at things like where are the other public access sites that have been opened up as a result of the pandemic, and really looking at where we knew there were higher percentages of community members that don't have internet access. And some of that data was not current even because, it was pre-pandemic data. And so then, just reaching out to community partners and community members to try to make the most informed choices and not just kind of do it arbitrarily, but make sure that we were really centering equity and how we were allocating our resources.
Yeah. Well, you guys have both mentioned data now, so I have to ask because it makes my nerdy local government heart happy. But so what kind of data are you guys looking at? What kind of measures are you looking at to either guide your work or track like how well or how much of an impact are we having?
I love that question. I'm going to dive in and say, there are 3 things that I'm always thinking of. How much did we do? How well did we do it? And at the end of the day, is anybody better off? Yeah. And so I think, when we're measuring our own work in our DEI, the work we lead out of the DEI department, just constantly bringing those 3 questions and how we, sometimes it's just capturing numbers, like how much did we do, but making sure that we're coming up with creative and effective ways to find out how well did we actually do it. And at the end of the day, who is better off and how, and is it, are we getting the outcomes that we need? And it's so critical because sometimes we might love something, but it's really not having the outcome we want. So we have to be able to take a hard look at the things we do and really with that critical eye and be willing to sometimes set things down or go a different direction when it's not having the impact we want.
Oh, totally. And that's like the hardest thing to do in local government generally, I think, is saying like, oh, we thought this program was great, or, we think it is good, but it's not having the outcome we wanted. And so, we need to shift gears. Like, is there one that comes to mind where you had to do that? Because that is a very hard thing to do. I think is anyone listening probably is nodding along with that.
I don't know that one comes to mind, but I will say just myself on my own learning journey, I can look back and see how I reflect on my own work a lot, and so I can definitely see where there were times in my career where I thought something, I loved something, or I thought it was, really great. I was really proud of it. But, just being really honest with yourself and thinking about yep, I'm not really sure if I could do that over again. I wouldn't do this. Yeah. I probably wouldn't do that, or I would have chose something different if I would have thought about it through a different lens.
Yeah, and I can think of a specific example that had to do with signs and posters around the time of the initial shutdown. So, the focus moved from live in-person programs and services to things like helping community members meet their technology needs that we know are necessary for staying afloat. And part of that was making sure we could help folks stay connected to the internet, expanding our Wi-Fi signal to outside, as Christy mentioned, and circulating hotspot devices, some limited laptop distribution. But also it was creating hard copy posters and flyers with critical information that community members needed, especially in those first few weeks and months after the shutdown. But as we partnered with and stayed in communication with other organizations who were kind of working to do the same thing and kind of ideating and figuring out how we're going to do this, trying to support those who are especially vulnerable, making sure that folks actually have what they need, we learned that some of those efforts to spend dollars to print out materials wasn't really where we needed to go with things. Like maybe because we were so shut down, people weren't going to be in these places where we were going to be putting these flyers. And so that would be a fruitless effort. It seemed like the right thing to do initially, but once we started talking to people and learned more, what we learned said, hey, yeah, maybe we could use our efforts in a different area here. So it's always tough, you think but that's why it's so important to really kind of understand what do we know and what do we need to know and what's missing here,
Well, and I'm curious, I know you guys aren't part of the city of Minneapolis, but, after we talked with Joy Marsh-Stevens from the city a few months after the protests surrounding the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And I'm curious, from your guys' perspective at the library, like what was, the impact of that on y'all, and like how did that change maybe, how the library was operating or how you guys were approaching your DEI work? Because obviously it had I would just speak general. I feel like, anybody doing this kind of work across the country, it either accelerated it or highlighted it in new ways. And so I'm curious kind of from your perspective, like something happening in your backyard. And yeah.
Well, I will say literally it was in our backyard. For some of our, as Christy mentioned, we have 41 different library locations, and they're spread all throughout Hennepin County, which is a sizable county. Many are located within the city proper. And there were 3 specifically that were directly in what I would say ground zero areas. One was right just blocks away from where George Floyd was killed, and then the other 2 right off of a major street called Lake Street in Minneapolis. That was the spark of the protests starting. That was like around the 3rd precinct area where the police station was, that the first few days of protests started happening. So it was literally in our backyard for some physical location. So that's one aspect of it. How do we support the people around, the staff around, the physical facility structure, the community members who depended on that. And then also the again, just like with COVID, and we were in COVID, which is so fascinating that all this is happening at once, right?
Yeah.
The kinds of things that we were starting to put into place as far as rerouting programs, rethinking our services, shifting gears for COVID safety protocols. Now we had to be thinking about all the trauma that was being experienced in our community with our community members and many of our staff, myself included. And so one of the things that came out of that was we have what's called we had an equity, diversity, and inclusion change team that was comprised of different staff members of multiple job classes that would come together and just kind of talk through solutions, make recommendations. We would support staff in various different projects and activities. And during that time, we came together with that team, had some discussions, and out of those discussions came a recommendation to have some open discussions around the events that were occurring. And from those open discussions, we learned that maybe having some affinity spaces right? Where we could have some BIPOC staff and our white ally staff might be good to do, because there was a need for people to be able to speak and feel supported in spaces that felt safe in those moments where everyone was so tender. And I lead a couple of those affinity spaces. Also, I will say, too, this is making me think about the healing circles. That also was a recommendation that came out of that EDI Change team. And those were cultural affinity healing circle spaces, too. So lots of different recommendations came out of that time. There was just such a strong need to respond, and we were just doing everything that we could to meet that need as fast as we could, that we saw that it was there. And maybe I should pass it over to Christy and see if I've left anything out.
No, that was great. I think the open discussions kind of during that time when we really had multiple crises happening at the same time, were just, they weren't perfect, but it really gave people a space to come together when many people were working remotely. And it felt like just having spaces to nurture collective care. And it's been great to see the affinity spaces and healing circles kind of grow out of that as a way that we're just working to support each other, because the pandemic has had, all of this has just had a deep impact on our communities and also on our staff. Working in libraries, the work in libraries has changed a lot, just by the very nature of the pandemic. And so I think that's been one of the biggest things, is just making sure that we're creating those really meaningful spaces for staff to come together and be able to decompress and take care of each other.
Yeah. Well, it's recognizing the trauma and the burden that folks are bringing in, from just their day-to-day life into work, and, creating space for them to process that or support them. Like, we've had folks write for the ELJ website about, that same kind of feeling that, like, you have to come in and do your job when you're dealing, with all this weight or baggage from the outside world. And that, I would imagine as a workplace that is really supportive to be able to just show that, you value your people enough to, like, create space for them.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, most definitely. And we've received such good feedback from folks who've been participating in those spaces. And like Christy said, it's been growing. So it's work that was born of fire and everything that happened around that time, but it's meaningful work that we learned. There's strong value in doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I could add one more thing too, I think that grew out of that time. We have been very fortunate to have the opportunity to collaborate with Myron Metcalf, who is a Star Tribune columnist and ESPN reporter. And he wrote a column in the Star Tribune. And I think the headline was something like, if you want to learn about racism, or if you want to learn how we get out of this situation we're in, open up a book. And so the theme of the column was really, the way that books can help us understand how we got here and our history, and that for Minnesotans to really, if we want to see change in Minnesota, we need to all come together and learn and talk. And there was kind of this hunger for conversations and learning, and for that to not just be a flash in the pan, but for that to really be something that is sustained over time. And so after that column, we had a supervisor at one of our libraries send an email to Myron and say, hey, I'd love to be part of your book club, and maybe the library can play a role. And so we connected, and we've launched the Marianne Key Book Club, which, we just finished our third season. And that's just been really great as an opportunity for us to, a lot of our work focuses internally, but this is a great example of how we've been able to support community conversations and learning around race racism and anti-racism, and some of the community leader panel discussions we've had have just been really powerful. And there's been kind of a different focus to each season depending on what book we choose. And so that's just been another thing that's grown out of that time that I've been really excited and happy to see continue.
That's very cool. Yeah. And what a way to kind of continue the conversation. Like you said, that's really cool. So I guess, and appreciate kind of going back to probably a painful time, but I was curious. So I guess looking forward, I'm curious, what are maybe some initiatives you're working on, or something that you'll be focusing on here in the next year or two that maybe our listeners can look out for, or that you'll be coming back to share with Gov at some point.
Well, one thing that is coming up for us, it's not something that we're leading out of the DEI department, but our library is about to embark on a strategic planning process. And we have a couple of external organizations and consultants that we're working with that have a really strong equity, diversity, inclusion, access, expertise and focus. And so just really looking forward to an opportunity for some community engagement, to listen and hear from our residents about library services and our spaces in the future. And that's something that I think is on the horizon that is really exciting for us as a library. And one other thing that I'll just highlight, and then I'm going to bounce it over to Ayanna. We are working to ensure that we're focusing on accessibility, which is so important, and I think is often a gap in our DEI work. And so we're partnering with a local organization this year to do some staff training on really everybody building an access mindset to how we provide service, and also just looking to collaborate across our organization to make sure that we're making sure our spaces are accessible, and that we're really bringing an access mindset to what we do. Yeah. Ayanna, you want to share anything else?
Sure. I'll just piggyback on that. You said so much. And I guess for me, what's next and what's exciting to me is, as Christy mentioned, a lot of the tools that we have acquired are fairly new, like a racial equity impact tool. And I'm just really excited about people starting to use that tool more. And I really enjoy supporting folks using the tool. I really appreciate having time to serve as a consultant with staff and with teams, and to encourage people to move forward in using that tool and other tools that we have. Just having really great conversations and helping people to build on the skills that they have. And I get excited about building my own skills. This is iterative. We're all learning how to do this and how to do it better. So that's something that I see up and coming that actually is inspiring to me as an organization and as a person who works at our organization.
Very cool. Well, awesome. Well, and I think that's probably as good of a place as any to end our conversation. So I'll ask our, and this is usually the hardest question for guests, but our last question, if you could be the Gov of DJ, what song would you pick as the exit music for this episode? And I'll say, since there's two of you, you can either pick one together or you can each do one, and we'll let our producer pick.
I'll jump in first, but would love for us to both pick. So Ayanna, if you've got one, throw it in. I'm going to say I'll Take You There by the Staple Singers.
Nice.
And I've got a different mood. I was thinking Miles Davis kind of blue, maybe Blue and Green or All Blues.
Both great picks. It's going to be tough on our producers. Well, with that, thank you. That ends our episode for today. Christy, Ayanna, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me, sharing your expertise and all the work that you've done. So we really appreciate you guys taking the time.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
Truly. Thank you.
And for our listeners, GovLove is brought to you by engaging local government leaders, and the best way to support GovLove is to become an ELGL member. You can reach us online at elgl.org/GovLove or on Twitter at the handle @GovLovePodcast. Subscribe to GovLove on your favorite podcast app, and if you're already subscribed, go tell a friend or colleague about this podcast. Help us spread the word that GovLove is the go-to place for local government stories. And as a reminder, the ELGL annual conference is coming up this October, 13th and 14th in Phoenix, Arizona. You can learn more by going to elgl.org/ELGL22. And with that, thank you for listening. This has been GovLove, a podcast about local government.